Are you also tired of one-size-fits-all weight loss plans? Meet Noom, the personalized solution that meets you where you are. Noom is able to understand your unique needs, from dietary restrictions to medical concerns. Unlike restrictive programs, Noom embraces your lifestyle and choices. Discover a sustainable approach to weight loss, tailored just for you. Honestly, Noom felt like it was made for me. It's not just about what I eat, it's about understanding why. With Noom, I've learned so much about myself and built healthier habits that stick. It's all about progress, not perfection. Say goodbye to restrictive diets and experience the Noom app for yourself with personalized lessons and expert coaching. Noom's psychology and biology-based approach has helped over 5.2 million people achieve their goals. Stay focused on what's important to you with Noom's psychology and biology-based approach. Sign up for your trial today at Noom.com. That's Noom.com. And check out Noom's first ever cookbook, The Noom Kitchen, for 100 healthy and delicious recipes to promote better living. Available to buy now wherever books are sold. You love podcasts, the stories, the laughs, the unexpected turns. But when this episode ends, the silence starts. Not anymore. Audiobooks.com turns that silence into your next great adventure. With over 450,000 titles, from bestsellers to hidden gems, your love for listening just found its new best friend. And because you already know the joy of audio, we're giving you 3 free audiobooks to start your journey. Imagine your favorite podcast, now with unlimited episodes. That's audiobooks.com. Keep the story going. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. Because for podcast lovers like you, the end of an episode is just the beginning. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and for the first time in a long time, I am not coming to you alone as a solo host. As many of you know, this podcast was created as a joint venture, and ever since my former co-host, Catherine Brobeck, passed away at the end of 2021, I've brought on friends and colleagues whenever I possibly could to share the load and to engage in a dialogue with me about whatever topic we might be discussing. And today, I think I've kind of outdone myself because I have not just one, not just two, but 3 co-hosts who are joining me to discuss a topic I have been eager to highlight for a while now. It's a topic I wish this podcast had done a better job of analyzing when Catherine and I were doing our systematic review of Christie's novels. Today's episode is going to be all about ableism in Agatha Christie's oeuvre. And my hope is that it will feature some of the conversations that should have taken place in a deeper and more thoroughgoing way whenever Catherine and I were discussing depictions stuck in their time in Christie's books. You may have no idea what I mean when I say ableism, and that is okay. We are going to get into it. But before we do, I want to introduce my 3 co-hosts, all of whom live in the United Kingdom. This is going to be a very British episode, listeners, so let's all rejoice in that. My first co-host is Jenni Bishop, who is a speech and language therapist and the mother of a teenage daughter. Jenni became unwell at the age of 26 and was later diagnosed with hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. These conditions cause her to be both physically disabled and chronically ill. She has been an Agatha Christie fan since she was 11 years old, and she has a sizable collection of books, DVDs, and games to show for it. She also loves heavy metal and retro style, what I would call a vintage aesthetic, particularly from the 1940s and 1950s. I got to know Jenni over email. She reached out to me as a listener of the podcast, and we've talked at great length about ableism in Christie, among other topics. I've honestly learned so much from her over the years, and I'm so excited for her to come on to share some of that knowledge with you all. My second co-host is Tina Hodgkinson. Tina has a mobility disability and is in cancer remission. She is a social worker, a qualified London tour guide, and the London ambassador for Ewan's Guide, a disabled access charity. Tina wrote an authoritative article for the Agatha Christie Limited website titled Christie's London, which details Christie's connections to various sites in and around that great metropolis. She has spoken multiple times at both the International Agatha Christie Festival and the Agatha Christie Conference, and she is currently looking for an agent and publisher for her book titled Agatha Christie's London. I know there are more than a few agents and publishers who listen to this podcast, so please get in touch if you are interested. I've had the pleasure of listening to more than one of Tina's talks over the years. They are brilliant, so I have no doubt this book will be a smashing success whenever it reaches shelves. My third co-host has chosen to go by her first name only. Emma lives with chronic illness and acquired disability, meaning she has experienced life as both a non-disabled person and a disabled person. She lives with her awesome husband, awesome was her word, and their 2 cats. And like Jenni, Emma first reached out to me as a listener of the podcast, and I was blown away by the depth and the nuance of what she had to say about Agatha Christie and ableism. Welcome, Jenni, Tina, and Emma.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
All right. Well, it is so exciting to have all 3 of you here to share your thoughts and perspective and scholarly analysis on an issue in Christie that doesn't get nearly enough attention, including on this very podcast, as I've already mentioned. And one of the reasons for that is that I am not a disabled person. So this is one of those episodes where the goal is to gain a perspective other than mine. And for that reason, I am going to speak as little as possible. I should say I'm going to try to speak as little as possible. This will probably come as a relief to my 3 co-hosts and perhaps to many listeners as well. You have heard more than enough from me on previous episodes. You will hear more than enough from me in episodes to come. One point I want to make up front is as to spoilers. This is necessarily going to be a rather spoiler-heavy episode, so I am going to do something I don't normally do and read out a full list of the titles we'll be discussing. So be forewarned that there are spoilers ahead for the following stories: The Clocks, The Pale Horse, Ordeal by Innocence, The Blue Geranium, The Mystery of the Acid Soil, which is one of the short stories in the new Miss Marple collection, not actually by Agatha Christie. Third Girl, Towards Zero, The Unexpected Guest, Dumb Witness, Elephants Can Remember, The Hollow, Curtain, The ABC Murders, The Body in the Library, A Caribbean Mystery, Mrs. McGinty's Dead, and Death on the Nile. Yes, that is a lot of titles, which shows just how much research and care went into the conversation you're about to hear. Get ready for some textual analysis, folks. But first, I would love to start in a bit of an academic way by defining our terms, or more specifically, the one big term we'll be discussing today. So to do this, I'm going to turn first to Jenni. Jenni, could you give us a sense of what exactly ableism is? What does this word mean?
Sure. So I think it's really anything that excludes, demeans, or harms disabled people. That can include chronically ill people who consider themselves disabled, like myself. It includes prejudice, so things like sort of assuming incompetence, as well as what people would consider to be more active discrimination, such as not allowing physical access into buildings or not employing people who are disabled or chronically ill. I think it's really important that obviously Emma, myself and Tina, we all have different experiences and we are not speaking for every disabled person who exists. So we'll be coming with our own sort of personal spin on things. Our experiences of ableism, some of them will be universal and some of them will be more specific depending on what people's particular disability is. And I think it's really important that first and foremost, disabled people are people. So we are a really diverse bunch. So we need also to think about intersectionality. There are a lot of people who are living not only with having to deal with ableism, but they may also be dealing with racism, homophobia, transphobia, sexism as well. So I think it's really important that we bear that in mind, that, you know, experiences will be very wide and varied. But I think that key idea of disabled people being excluded, demeaned or harmed is helpful in terms of ableism. I don't know if Emma and Tina might want to add or interject something there.
No, I think you've answered brilliantly. Thank you.
Yes, I think you've covered it very well.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so Tina, I guess keeping in this definitional vein, I believe you were going to speak a little bit more broadly about models of disability.
So we've got two models of disability, and the first one is the medical model. So disabled people are disabled by their medical condition. It could be a physical or a mental health impairment. In the UK, it's estimated that 1 in 5 people define themselves as disabled. And that's actually believed to be an underestimation. And it's actually about 1 in 4. We have a very broad range of access, needs and experiences. As a result of this, we are seen as requiring medical intervention or treatment. So the idea is to be cured. So, for example, for me, when I had my fall, the idea was to get me to physio and to get me to be able-bodied again. So it puts the burden on the person. So we're the problem that needs to be fixed or treated. And also, often traditionally, medicine has also been designed by the able-bodied. So they're sort of imposing what they think we need to happen as disabled people. It's been a traditional model that has been sort of preceded, but just to say, at the time when Agatha was writing, it was very much in vogue. And Agatha herself is a health professional. She was a VAD, voluntary aid detachment nurse in the First World War. So she was caring for soldiers who were injured and sick, who were coming back from the home front in Torquay Hospital. And with that, she was also, if you read her autobiography, there's mention of her actually throwing the limbs in the furnace when people had their arms or their legs amputated. So she had very sort of graphic experience of disability firsthand, caring for disabled people. Also, then she moves on to become a qualified pharmaceutical dispenser. And she does that during the First World War and the Second World War. And that's sort of where I would have pictured her as. She is a health professional who is living at the time of the medical model of disability. If we move on to the 1980s, there's a person called Mike Oliver, who was a disabled activist, and he created the social model of disability. So this is what's considered to be the accepted definition today, or the accepted model today, disability. So what he did was he separated out the impairment and disability. So the impairment is the person's medical condition or the injury. So, for example, in my case, I have lower back problems, and that is my medical condition. And he defined disability as the social and environmental factors which take little account of people's impairment. So there's an assumption by non-disabled people when they're creating society in terms of the infrastructure, for example, designing a building, there'll be an assumption that everyone else is like them. So traditionally, there's been a lack of thought about things like ramps, accessible toilets, and so forth. So when I go out in society, what disables me is the infrastructure I face. So, for example, certain restaurants in London I can't go to because they have got stairs or they've got an accessible toilet. Likewise, if I travel on public transport, the tube isn't totally step-free. So again, I go on bus. The infrastructure at the moment limits my choices, and it also affects the amount of time it takes for me to get to A to B. So that's sort of in a practical way how ableism affects me. So that's the social model. And that, as I said, came in the 1980s. So in theory, this was after Agatha Christie's time.
Thank you for that, Tina. I think that's fascinating and something I knew nothing about, the medical model versus the social model. I think that actually is going to really help frame this conversation that we're going to have vis-a-vis depictions of disability and ableist tropes in Christie. I'd love to turn to Emma now just to speak a little bit about ableism in popular culture, specifically how it distorts the lived reality of disabled people and other ways in which it may be harmful. I'd love if you would just speak a little bit to that, Emma.
Hi, thanks everybody. That was some really interesting stuff. I know Tina quoted a different statistic, but globally, the WHO estimates 1/6 of the world's population is disabled. Yet disabled people are massively underrepresented in all areas of public life. This means that most people get their understanding of what it's like to live with a disability from popular culture. This informs their unconscious biases, affecting how disabled people are treated and included or not included in the real world. Depictions of disability in popular culture tend to be based on the medical model of disability, as Tina described, but most disabled people's lived experiences fit more comfortably within the social model. This means representations in popular culture are often inaccurate and harmful. For example, the idea that disability is a tragedy and that a character needs to be cured in order to have a happy and fulfilling life, such as Tiny Tim in A Christmas Carol or Will in Me Before You. In reality, many disabled people have no desire to be cured, and many live happy and fulfilling lives alongside their disability. But this stereotype leads to others making negative assumptions about their life and regarding them with pity. When disabled people are portrayed as not taking part in everyday activities, this can contribute to significant parts of communities being set up with no access for disabled users. And another common stereotype, the disabled villain, very common in James Bond films, for example, promotes fear and mistrust of disabilities and disabled people. So representation in popular culture is very important. As Agatha Christie's texts are still so widely read today and used as inspiration for adaptations, her depictions of disability are still having an impact. It's therefore important that we approach her depictions of disability with an awareness of what is an appropriate portrayal and what could be harmful.
Thank you for that, Emma. I think that really does help to frame the conversation as we move on to Christie's texts specifically. You know, we all did some prep for this episode, listeners, and I was really struck as we were talking amongst ourselves as to how many depictions of disabled characters that there really are in Christie. So I'd love to kind of open up the floor because there are so many different avenues that we could take now in talking about specific characters and specific tropes that come up in Christie again and again. I know that Tina had some interesting thoughts about one Millicent Pebmarsh in The Clocks.
Okay, I'll start us off then. I'm actually quite positive about the representation of Millicent Pebmarsh, to be honest. The Clocks is probably not one of Agatha's most loved stories, shall we say. It was published in 1963, and one of the characters is Millicent Pebmarsh, who is a blind teacher. And basically, the story opens up, and I'm sorry, there is going to be a plot spoiler at the end, so I warn in advance. But basically, there is a body that is found in her house. Now, what I found when I was reading this book, and I did a paper for it at the Agatha Christie conference in 2019, I felt actually very positive about it because I felt like the ableism was actually challenged in a way that it isn't when we have usually people who've got physical disabilities. So we start off with Colin Lamb, who's sort of co-investigating it. He makes the assumption that because the man has been stabbed with a kitchen knife, he assumes that it lets out Millicent, because how could a blind woman be able to stab a man? And then he questions if she's actually really blind. And I think that's one of the things that come up even today for disabled people. You know, people make assumptions about how disabled we are. And people sort of make decisions about, you know, what they feel we can and cannot do. And Colin then goes on to say it seems far-fetched to think about an able-bodied man being stabbed by a blind woman, but maybe he was doped. So he sort of dismisses Millicent as being the murderer. We've got D.I. Hardcastle, who's interviewing Millicent. And the comment in Agatha's book is that he looked searchingly at her with the added security of knowing that she could not return his survey. And I thought this was quite interesting because here, Agatha's actually recognising Hardcastle's able-bodied privilege. He's got the advantage over Millicent. And there's that power imbalance in the relationship with the person who is able to see and the person who's got a visual impairment. And I thought that was actually quite interesting that Agatha actually raised that he's thinking he's got the upper hand over this disabled and blind woman. Just generally with it, there are several comments that are made. There's expressions of disbelief that Millicent can be able to walk, oh my goodness, or even navigate her surroundings because she does that without appearing to be blind. So there's all this sort of negative bit, but I actually found there was quite a few positive bits. So if we look at Millicent and we look at Sheila Webb, so Sheila Webb's the person who comes from the typing pool to actually do some work for Millicent, and she's the person who initially finds the body. And what does she do? She runs out of the house screaming. She's in panic, she's in fear. But Colin notices that Millicent is very calm with it. So the whole demeanour between the two characters, Millicent is still very much in control of things, whereas Sheila's having a bit of a panic attack and really upset. So just the two different approaches from the two different women. And then when Colin enters the house and he finds out that Millicent is actually showing a lot of empathy towards Sheila. She's offering to try and comfort her. She invites her back into the house, but not into the same room where the body is. She's doing that, and Sheila is just in a state of panic. So Millicent is actually very capable, and she's getting on with things, and she's actually trying to help others. And then Colin then asks her if she can manage. And Millicent's response is, "My dear young man, I've made meals for myself in my own kitchen ever since I came to live in this house 14 years ago. To be blind is not necessarily to be helpless." And I think that's just a really positive comment. Actually, it's addressing the ableism there. She's putting it back to that. And Colin apologises for it. And what I like, despite all the other bits with Millicent, and there are other bits that can be unpicked, she comes across as a confident, independent, disabled woman. And she's able to articulately challenge the ableist assumptions that are made about her. And what she does is that she educates and she explains. Colin ends up apologising for his ableism, and he acknowledges that he's been stupid. Millicent is very competent in navigating her environment. She hears Sheila breathing, so that's how she knows that someone else is in the room. She touches the dead man's face and the surface of the clock in an attempt to identify them. But what I love the most about Millicent is, plot spoiler ahead, the final twist in the plot is Millicent is discovered to be the head of a spy ring, which she runs from her own home and the information sent out in Braille. Now, Janet Morgan, who wrote one of the biographies of Agatha, noticed that Agatha included that because she was really happy about her translation of her work into Braille, and that had had an impact on her directly. And also The Murder of Roger Ackroyd in 1935 was the very first book that was done as a talking book by the RNIB, which is a national association for blind people in the UK. So I thought that was very interesting with it. And if you also go to the memorial in London for Agatha Christie, her books are represented in different languages, but there's also Braille included. So I think it has had an impact on her. But what I really love about it is the end challenges readers' assumptions about ableism and gender stereotypes. It's subversive because it uses Braille. It's a method of communication that is almost exclusively used by blind and visually impaired people, and therefore being inaccessible to most non-disabled people. And that is the system of communication. And what I loved about it when I talked to my friend Robbie Crow, who's a partially sighted disabled activist, he told me that the Royal Mail articles for the blind scheme came in 1965, and blind and visually impaired people get free postage in the UK. So just think about it. Not only was it a good scheme, it's actually cost effective in running your own spy ring. You can do it on the cheap. So anyway, that's all I've got to say about the clocks.
That's really fascinating. And I think you're absolutely right that there's that lovely mixture of the really problematic representations, which are then challenged, and then actually having one of the protagonists actually able to sort of say, hey, I got that wrong and I need to kind of check my assumptions. That's actually really powerful, isn't it? And I hadn't really thought too much about the clocks. As you say, it's not one of the favourites, and it's not one of my favourites. So perhaps I haven't given it the time that it deserves. But that's a really, really fascinating evaluation.
Yeah, I agree that it is very fascinating, and in many ways she is a good example of a disabled character in that she is independent and capable and she has agency in her choices. But there are a couple of negative things that I've noticed, a couple of patterns when it comes to disabled people in domestic situations. I think that pretty much all of Agatha's most capable and independent characters, disabled characters, are single. She doesn't portray married, disabled characters with that kind of independence and capability. I mean, I absolutely get what Tina described about the spiring and the braille, and I absolutely get that. But it kind of reminds me of the portrayal of Mr. Venables in The Pale Horse, and that he's also a strong, capable, independent, disabled person. And he doesn't turn out to be the murderer, but you still can't trust him. And that's a very common stereotype with disabled people, is that they can't be trusted to stick to society's moral and legal frameworks. And I feel that there's a similarity between those two characters, but that is not at all to take away from what Tina said.
I love that point about the disabled characters who are most capable being portrayed outside of romantic partnerships or even maybe family life. A good example of that, and I know we did discuss this in some of the emails, I think you made some brilliant points about it, Emma, was in Ordeal by Innocence, the relationship between Philip and Mary, which is fascinating in that Mary seems almost to take a sort of glee in taking care, in inverted commas, of Philip, and Philip feels quite emasculated by it. I'm not going to say much more than that because I know, Emma, you had some really interesting things to say, but what I did want to kind of draw a parallel with is how people respond when they see my husband, who is obviously my romantic partner, but he's also my carer. And particularly if they see him when I'm using the wheelchair and I can't self-propel because I don't have the upper body ability to do that. And so my husband pushes the wheelchair, and people will often sort of congratulate him, or what a wonderful person he is, for sticking with this wife he's sort of been lumbered with, as though I'm some sort of burden, and he's an absolute hero for not running off. I don't know. I just think there's something very interesting in the way that relationships between disabled and non-disabled people are portrayed in popular culture and in the media that probably feeds into that. And I wonder if this is perhaps an early example of that.
I was just going to say, for swatting for this, I reread The Blue Geranium, which has got the character of Mary Pritchard, who is murdered. She's already died, so it's sort of talking about it retrospectively. And you've got Arthur and Dolly Bantry talking about Mary Pritchard. And the negativity really came out on this, looking at the relationship, calling her semi-invalid. So again, we've got this whole notion of, are people really disabled, or are they sort of milking it, shall we say, for want of a better word? And then he says, I believe she had something wrong with it, plays it for all it's worth, complained from morning to night. And then he goes on to say, most men would have hit her over the head with a hatchet long ago. And Dolly also says, dreadful woman, if George, which was her husband, had braved her with a hatchet, if there were any women on the jury, he would have been triumphantly acquitted. So there's the whole thing about disability not being believed. And also, although it's in jest, they're actually condoning the murder of a disabled person. And disabled women are twice as likely as non-disabled people to experience domestic violence. So I think there's certainly an undertone with it. And I think for me, Millicent stands out very differently from a lot of the other disabled characters. But I feel like there just needed to be that balance and acknowledge that Agatha did something right with Millicent. Well, in my eyes, anyway.
No, I totally agree. We're not here to say that every single depiction of a disabled person that she wrote was bad. There's so much nuance, isn't there, to disability, and we're going to find good and bad, and it's right to point out the good.
Definitely. I wonder if this is a good time. I looked at the new Marple stories, and I was so pleased when I first read them to see how much work had obviously been done by the authors to challenge kind of negative stereotypes about loads of minority groups. And it was really fantastic to see that. But I did find some instances, and there was one particular in Kate Moss's story, The Mystery of the Acid Soil, which I really enjoyed. And it's really interesting because there is this character of Mrs. Cooper who is deceased when we sort of come across her. And it says, Mrs. Cooper was rather a trying woman. Her only interests in life were her garden and her own ill health. Nothing was ever quite right. And then on the following page, Miss Marple asks, you said his wife was in poor health. Do I take it her death was expected? And the reply, not at all. Dr. Barden was of the opinion there was nothing actually wrong with her at all. So again, we see repeated even by modern authors, and this isn't at all any kind of attack on Kate Moss. And it actually, in some ways, those two little passages sort of almost lend more of an authenticity to this as a Miss Marple story, because there are lots of examples of this almost throwaway reference to these malingerers who are typically women. And it made me a little bit sad when I read it, that actually, it would have been so nice if there'd been some pushback maybe, or, maybe if that hadn't been in the text at all, but if it had, that had somehow been challenged by the worldly Miss Marple, who, will have seen a lot of people who were thought not to be ill, who perhaps then later, everybody realized they were ill or whatever. So it's just interesting how it sort of still persists even in a volume like this, which on the whole, I think is really quite progressive in how it takes forward the work of Agatha Christie in a way that has more in common with more modern values. But we still see examples like that of sort of casual ableism that can be very harmful.
When you've got a woman with an invisible illness and that invisible illness also fluctuates, that's like somehow the hat trick of things society is to be most suspicious about. And so it does, unfortunately, it does certainly reflects my experience, and it reflects a lot of people's experiences. But when you're writing about it, you have to be clear that it's the characters that are ableist, not the story. And it doesn't always come across that way, does it?
Yeah, absolutely right. And that is an important distinction to make, isn't it? I think Kemper and Catherine have always been careful to make that distinction between, is this in the mouth of the author or is it in the mouth of the character? And I think that's important. But in some cases, it doesn't always matter, because if the portrayal is there on the page, it can still be harmful, because it can still add to that bank of information that people have unwittingly taken in to lay down all these stereotypes.
Tina has obviously taken an approach of looking very carefully at the language used and the tone and everything, which is obviously really interesting to me, because with my level of brain fog, I'm just not up to doing that. But my approach has been to look more at repeated themes. And I've noticed repeated themes that don't necessarily seem a problem in one book, but when you see them building up, it becomes more concerning. And I have noticed a pattern of othering when disabled people are in romantic relationships. And it shows up in several different ways. It's not always repeated in the same way. But as I said before, one way it shows up is that her most capable disabled characters are all single. I've also noticed a pattern of disabled characters who are married at the start of a story ending up dead by the end of it. And I haven't read every Agatha Christie, but I can't think of a married disabled character who doesn't die by the end of the book. I've also noticed that an awful lot of the disabled or chronically ill women are married to medical men, or somewhere at the end of the book they get together with a medical man, like Norma Restorick in Third Girl. She stands out because disabled and chronically ill people are not often included when Agatha Christie does the romantic pairing up at the end of her stories. But when they are included, you tend to get a woman paired up with a medical man, or two chronically ill or disabled characters being paired together. One example in Towards Zero being Angus McWhirter, who tried to take his own life, and Audrey Strange, who'd had a nervous breakdown. And it feels very much like othering to me. It feels like a discomfort with disabled people being in a relationship with non-disabled people.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I hadn't really thought about that. And I definitely picked up on the sense of othering, but I hadn't thought about it so much in terms of thinking about those romantic pairings. I can't think of an example of a disabled person who's married who isn't dead by the end. There might be one, but I can't think of one, which in itself, the fact there's no obvious example is really telling, isn't it?
What I was going to say is, and it's not to take away from what Emma's saying, but I think the other issue is when we're looking at Agatha Christie, everyone is not what they seem, because that's the whole point of a murder mystery in a way. But I think the problem is that when it happens and it's disabled people, people begin to see a pattern with it and they begin to make assumptions, particularly if we're already in a society where ableism is still pretty rife. And I think one of the things I would like to say, in terms of my own personal perspective, we all like to think that we've got all the isms sorted out, or we hope we're that type of person. And I think when it comes to ableism, I think from my own personal experience I thought I was a good disabled person ally when I was non-disabled. I've been a social worker for 30 years. I haven't worked, with children with disabilities per se, but I've worked in children and families. And I thought I had a sort of goodish grasp on things. When I became disabled, I realised that I absolutely knew nothing about disability because I hadn't had that lived experience. And I think what it is, it's not necessarily the big things that happen, the fact that the infrastructure isn't perfect for us or whatever. It's what I'd call those sort of mini microaggressions that we have every day. Particularly when I first became disabled, people would think it was okay to stand at the bus stop and ask me about my medical condition. What's happened to you? Da, 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 da. You wouldn't ask someone about their sex life or their, how much money they've got in the bank or whatever. So why do you ask for personal medical information? It feels like when we're disabled people, we're out there, there's a role that we're meant to be fulfilling for people. And one of those is that the normal barriers sometimes are sort of broken down, and it's okay to ask us things. It's okay to be curious. And when I first became disabled, I thought people were actually genuinely interested. That was the naive me. And what I would find out is when I didn't give them the answer that they wanted or what they expected, they pretty soon switched off. And I just get to a stage now where people have to know me a while before they know what my disability is about. What's important is what my access needs are and how you treat me as a human being, not what my impairment is.
Absolutely. I certainly found the same. I work with children, many of whom are disabled, and the same as you, when I became disabled, I felt like actually I hadn't been as good an ally as I thought I had been. But I find that's true in my journey to try and become a person who is an ally to all people who feel marginalised and are marginalised by society. But I think it's always a journey. And I think if something isn't, even within disability, I know what it's like to have my particular disabilities, to be disabled in the particular way that I am, but it doesn't mean that I have full understanding of every disability that is possible or what every disabled person's experience is like. And I think that's why it's really important that we're always conscious as human beings, really, of our own privilege and how, although as disabled people, we have a lack of privilege and non-disabled people have a privilege that we don't have, we may also have other areas of privilege. We may also have other areas where we're lacking in privilege. But I think it's quite an ongoing process. And like you, Tina, I think the way that you respond to people crossing those boundaries changes as actually you become more aware. Actually, you notice the harm it does to yourself, and then I think that helps you to be more aware of the harm that's done to other people when they experience microaggressions for whatever reason, whether that's because they're disabled or for some other reason.
The other thing is that I have my own internal ableism as well. Even when you're disabled, it isn't like you've got the one-upmanship or whatever of knowing everything about what ableism is about. We can have internal ableism, or we can also not know about other people's disability or whatever. It isn't like once you become disabled, you're in this sort of different place. I think we're all in different points. We've all got intersectionality. So there are all so many factors that are affecting us. And the discussion is about inclusivity and representation and diversity. And a lot of the time, the disabled person perspective has been missing from that traditionally.
Yeah, and I wanted to add to that so often the burden is on the disabled people to get their message across and to alleviate non-disabled people's fears about disability or becoming disabled and to educate non-disabled people. And that's quite a burden to carry around for an individual and for a marginalised group. So this is one reason why this podcast is great. This episode is great because it's giving people an opportunity to learn, hopefully. And we are here because we've chosen to be here. We're not in the street using a wheelchair, having a random stranger come up and ask questions. This is how we've chosen to speak about our lived experiences and how they relate to popular culture.
It's on our terms, isn't it? And,
yes, that is exactly what I want to say. Thank you.
And I think Kemper has created a safe space to do that. I wouldn't go on any old podcast because I wouldn't necessarily feel safe, but this does feel safe. And that's really important as well, because we aren't always safe. When people approach you in the street and say things to you, they might be questions which is intrusive and unpleasant, but there's also the kind of harassment that you can get and the abuse that you can get as well. I certainly feel very vulnerable if I'm out and about on my own. I'm very aware of my surroundings, and I don't really want to get into a conversation with complete strangers about things that they don't need to know, or they might have some kind of agenda. That's why they want to find it out about me. I'm just a little bit worried that we've talked a lot about physical disability. Mm-hmm. We have actually talked about mental health as well, haven't we? But I was just thinking about the unexpected guest, which I know is a bit fringe because it's just like a little play. But I think the portrayal of the character of Jan, who is we're definitely supposed to infer that he has some kind of intellectual disability. He's portrayed as super dangerous. And spoiler alert, although he isn't actually the killer, he's manipulated by a well-meaning member of the household into confessing to a crime that he didn't commit. And then when he runs away and he gets shot and then they realize he didn't do it, they kind of go, oh, well, he probably would have killed someone anyway. They're like that when they get older. And that whole vibe is just so demonizing of intellectually disabled people. And actually, intellectually disabled people are much more likely to be victims of crime than to be perpetrators. And I just always find it a really troubling portrayal. And I think he's as much trapped in that horrible domestic situation as anybody else. He's very frightened about being sent away to an institution, which is a fear that a lot of disabled people live with. And I just think he's a character that perhaps often doesn't get discussed very much. But I just wondered Emma and Tina, what your thoughts about Jan might be.
I'm afraid I don't know the unexpected guest, but you made me gasp in your description of the portrayal. So that's kind of an indication of how horrifying it sounds.
I saw it a few years ago and I can't remember the details about it, but your summary's been really, really helpful. And I think it's also really nice to discuss Agatha's plays as well, because so often, we just think of the stories. She's the person who wrote The Mousetrap, which is the world's longest running play. She's the first woman in London's West End to have 3 plays simultaneously on in the West End. So she's a credit to herself as a playwright. So thank you for bringing that up. And because it's a play, I just didn't have a chance to go away and have a read of it.
If I can jump in for a second.
Yes, please.
I am familiar with The Unexpected Guest, and I really appreciate what you said, Jenny, because Catherine and I actually covered that on a Patreon episode, and I was really surprised by the depiction of Jan, and it made me reflect on the fact that in Agatha Christie's oeuvre, in the full-length novels, while we have so many depictions of disabled characters, both as to physical and mental aspects of disability, it's unusual for her to go to the place of mental illness being the cause for murder, i.e. the murderer being mentally ill. However, and I'm going to ask anyone who hasn't yet read Dumb Witness to fast forward a few minutes, we do actually have, I think, a situation that's a little bit analogous in Dumb Witness vis-a-vis Bella Tanios. I think there's a little bit of a similar treatment of Bella in Dumb Witness. We could conflate or compare to Jan in The Unexpected Guest. I'm wondering if you would agree with that and what your thoughts are on that.
It's really interesting because the character you're referring to in Dumb Witness, it's a much more nuanced portrayal. And I think my impression, I haven't read it for a while, but on reading it, that you sort of become slowly aware that Bella is not well. It sort of grows on you slowly.
It's worth noting, though, that I don't know the unexpected guest, but didn't you say that was an intellectual disability, which is not the same as a mental health condition?
Yes, good point. He's very much portrayed as intellectually disabled or learning disabled rather than mental health. But I'm not sure she was delineating that much between the two, to be honest, because I think the trope is that if somebody is learning disabled, then actually there's also a question mark over whether or not they are sane, to use an old-fashioned term that I think they would have thought about in those days, or in control of their behaviour, but also kind of morally lacking. So automatically wouldn't know right from wrong. I think it's kind of all mixed up in there. But my impression from reading it was that she was trying to portray somebody who's intellectually disabled. So different from Bella in that respect. Although I think Bella, but also the character in
Elephants Can Remember.
In Elephants Can Remember, yes, that's what I was going to say, Dorothea.
Well, actually, a really good point. But I was also thinking of In the Hollow that both Bella Tanios and
Gerda Christo.
Thank you. I think they're both portrayed as not only perhaps being mentally unwell, but also not terribly bright. They're both referred to as being dull, which I think was a term that was used to suggest that somebody wasn't particularly intelligent.
It was one of the politer terms that they used to define people in that category during that period.
But Elephants Can Remember is a really interesting... Did you want to say more about that, Emma? Because that's a really good point. I'd sort of forgotten about Dorothea.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously she's dead when the book starts, but she is a character who supposedly murdered her child and I think another one as well. And it just seems to be she's mentally ill. That's just why. I think she then is responsible for her own twin sister's death.
Yeah.
That seems problematic, to say the least. Yeah. I mean, there are loads of people around the world with mental health conditions who don't kill people and who are perfectly capable parents. And it's yet again playing into the stereotype that disabled people can't be trusted. Which is not good. I was going to bring up Curtin, which I think is, in my opinion anyway, the most problematic from an ableist perspective of all of her books. And I know you covered a decent amount of the ableism in your podcast specifically on Curtin. But one thing I noticed that I don't think got picked up is that obviously you talked about the conversation they had that they said was about euthanasia, but really we recognise that as a conversation about eugenics. And I think it's very striking that in that book, there are 3 characters with disabilities or impairments. There is a conversation about eugenics. And at the end of the book, all 3 of those characters with impairments and disabilities are all dead. Nobody else has been killed during the course of that novel. And I think that's really alarming. And it's also noteworthy to me that all 3 of those characters were involved in taking the life, not all of somebody else, but in trying to take the lives of another person. And there were 2 non-disabled people who attempted murder during the course of that book. But they both got redemption. They both got to live and carry on. And I just found that really alarming. And I didn't know if that was something other people had picked up on and what they thought.
I agree with you entirely. When I've reread it recently before the podcast episode, specifically for that reason, and actually there were parts where I actually had to kind of take a break because I found it was really throughout the text, and it's a shame because it's such a great book in so many ways, but it really did, I think, as Kemper and Catherine would say, marred the read, that I found it actually quite hard to get through, because there were just so many examples of those discussions about eugenics, and the portrayal of chronically ill and disabled people was distressing. And the whole story of Poirot pretending to be disabled, which obviously is, as Tina said, is part of the whole nobody is quite what they seem. But unfortunately, there is this trope that there are people pretending to be disabled, which, is so incredibly rare as to be not even worth mentioning. There's far more situations of people who are genuinely disabled and ill who get accused of putting it on or exaggerating than actually people who are sort of faking it. So yeah, I found it really hard to read. And actually, when I read it first, I was a teenager, so I was less aware probably of lots of societal sort of issues. And also I wasn't disabled at that point, or at least I didn't know that I had a genetic condition that was going to disable me later. So I didn't really pick up on that stuff so much then, but it really hit me on this reread more recently.
I only read Curtain last year because I could not cope with the thought of, let's do another spoiler, Poirot dying. The eugenics bit was very, very uncomfortable. But what got me was like those sort of smaller conversations that were going on. Poirot describing him and how he described himself about having to be attended to like a baby, being put to bed, washed and dressed. Hastings describing the once brilliant Poirot. So it implies that you can't be disabled and brilliant. If you also go back to Styles, the original story, you've got Hastings wounded in the First World War, and he's also reminiscing it in the story about how he was thinking at the time that like his life was over because he'd been wounded. But he realised it had only begun. And also we have in Mysterious Affair of Styles, Poirot limps badly. That was one of the observations that was made. And then mobility never ever comes again with it until we get to Curtain. But what I found very difficult also was the portrayal of Barbara Franklin, even the nurse thinking that she makes it up, So even her own nurse. So these are people who are medical professionals who are meant to be looking after people, not believing the person to be disabled. So it was all those little bits that was, to me personally, was more harder than the eugenics stuff. Maybe it's because it's the type of comments that I still hear on a regular basis. Yes. People make throwaway comments or whatever about disability. And in the end, Poirot's faked it, and something which Barbara was accused of all along in the novel.
Yeah.
So it is a brilliant book in many ways, but it's also highly problematic as well. So I'm really glad we spoke about it.
Yeah, I think that perhaps I read it slightly differently to you two, that I still believe that Poirot is disabled. I just believe that he's exaggerating his disability. And I think that the faking of a disability is one of the most problematic things in popular culture. And I think it is made worse when it's the good guy that does it, when it's the hero. And we're all left thinking, oh, Poirot's done a good thing. He's saved the world from this terrible man. And I do believe it fits with Poirot's character that he was always about a means to an end. He wasn't bothered about lying if it suited him. But yes, it's a difficult read. And I don't know if I'm overthinking it, but with the conversation about eugenics, they were basically saying, do we agree that it's okay to remove somebody from society who doesn't fit with what society needs or wants? And then at the end of the book, somebody does remove someone from society who they don't think fits. And that is uncomfortable.
Definitely it is. It's a lot of conversations about, the greater good for society, and this idea of the useless invalid who's got no value. It's a very kind of capitalist idea, I suppose, isn't it? Especially around, disabled people who aren't able to work or have to work, shorter hours, that kind of thing. That this idea that what the value that we bring just by virtue of being human is somehow, less important. But also that idea actually that if you are ill and or disabled, that you can't possibly do anything that would be considered work, or as Tina said earlier, be brilliant or be talented or have gifts to share. I do think people don't always understand, and I wouldn't ask anybody else on this call if they had the same issues, but something that happened to me a lot is what was happening to Barbara Franklin in Curtain, of medical professionals and also other people in authority, like teachers, who didn't believe me when I described my symptoms. And one of the most traumatic things about becoming disabled for me was going through that experience of having a lot of people making a judgment that because they couldn't see how I felt and the difficulties that I was experiencing, that I must be making it up and telling me it was all in my head, or I wanted to be ill, which of course I certainly did not. Nobody would choose that. And the trauma of that for me has actually been much harder to come to terms with than the actual change in terms of my mobility and my ability to care for myself and to live life as independently as I used to. And I just think that hit me really hard reading that, because it's bad enough when it's sort of random members of the public But if it's people in authority, and people, often it's people in the family, isn't it? Or in the Agatha Christie portrayals where people are not believed, it's maybe it's a husband. The fact that in the Kate Moss Marple story that I read from earlier, it was sort of talked about around the village that the doctor thinks there's nothing wrong with her, whether or not that's true or not. Maybe the doctor didn't say that, but, somebody started that rumor and said it came from the doctor. But it's that the trauma of not being believed is an insult to your whole character. It's saying that you are not a person of integrity. As Emma said, you're not a person who can be trusted. And it's very, very isolating. It's very scary. And even now, years later, when I've got diagnoses and sort of proof, as it were, that, I wasn't lying and I wasn't making it up, still really scary to go to any kind of medical or health appointment, because you don't know if the person you're going to meet is going to be dismissive and not take you seriously, or whether they are going to actually, do their job with compassion and putting you at the centre of the care. I just sometimes think it's important to share those personal things, because I think still people think, well, why does it matter? Why does it matter that Barbara Franklin's nurse doesn't believe her? But the real life effect can be really, really devastating.
Yeah, I absolutely agree 100% with what you said there, Jenny, and I have experienced very much the type of things you've been discussing, and it has a massive emotional impact, and it has a practical impact as well. If you're not believed, it's harder to get the care and support you're entitled to. So there is both the emotional impact, which in turn then obviously takes its impact on your physical health. We're all well aware that if we go through a bad time emotionally or mentally, it can have effects on your physical health, whether or not you've got a chronic illness. So when you've got that as well, and also on your loved ones who see how distressed you get as well, it affects everything.
Very much so. I was actually told when I was diagnosed and it was found out to be a genetic condition, I was told that if it had been diagnosed early and I'd been treated properly, I wouldn't be as disabled as I am now, which is kind of I'm not sure whether I wanted to know that or not. I don't dwell on that because I am where I am, but it's frustrating that actually I could have accessed treatment earlier. But because lots of medical professionals didn't believe me, I didn't get the treatment I need. So you're absolutely right, it's super dangerous. And also from a financial point of view. So if you are needing help from the state, you're having to jump through those hurdles of having to prove that you really do need the help that you need and that you can't do all these things, which is very confronting, having to kind of lay out all the things you can't do. And then you're kind of getting some stranger in an office to decide whether or not you deserve to have the money that you need to live on, which is one of the reasons that a lot of disabled people live in poverty. It isn't easy to get the support, and even if you're entitled to it.
I wonder if this might be a good time to bring it back to Agatha Christie and to talk about the ABC murders, because that is a rare example of a disabled person who isn't affluent and who doesn't have a support network, like most of her disabled characters do. They have all the support that they need. Either they pay for it, like Mr. Raphael, or they have a family around them or a community around them. But Alexander Bonaparte Cust doesn't have any of those things. And you can see that Christie is aware that without those socioeconomic advantages, he is more vulnerable. And I like that she shows this without resorting to either making him the villain, the killer, or a murder victim. I mean, obviously you can see he is the victim of the murderer, but by the end of the book, he's not the victim anymore. And I do like that she didn't give him a miracle cure as well, which so often non-disabled people like to do in popular culture, like to give their disabled characters. But in preparation for doing this podcast, I listened to some of Catherine and Kemper's old podcasts about the books, and it seemed from their discussion about him, he is written in a way that you're meant to pity him, which is a stereotype. So there are pros and cons in that one, but I wonder what everybody else thinks.
I think he's a really good character that you've picked up on, because he's got epilepsy, hasn't he? So what you've also said, Jenny, about sort of trying to get an answer, a solution, trying to make sense of what your medical condition is to begin with. So there's that bit about how he's grappling with that, but he's still needing to work full time. And he seems very isolated on his own with that. And I think, he is manipulated by the murderer. But yes, as you said, he comes out of it. He isn't murdered and he isn't the murderer at the end of it. And so I think he's untypical because he has a positive outcome if we say that he's not murdered or, he's not going to be executed for murder. And I think in many ways that he's also very untypical because there's very few working class characters in Agatha Christie's stories as well. And having the resources are very, very different, very, very different. I've got, as part of my work as Ewan's Guide Ambassador, speaking to the other ambassadors, some people, the cost of living crisis is really impacting them at the moment. I don't know what it's like over in the States, but over here in the UK, our electricity and gas bills have really gone up. And, there are people who are needing to have electricity to power, their equipment they need to keep them alive. It's as simple as that. So you've got that, and then you've got the very sort of affluent. So, for example, in Body in the Library, where you've got Conway Jefferson, and he basically, when he becomes disabled, and it's through a plane crash which kills both his wife and his 2 children, but you've got him basically throwing himself into work, and everything, as he says, everything he touches turns to gold. So you've got, you've generally got, a Mr. Raphael, who's in Caribbean Mystery. You've got these sort of really wealthy disabled people who, I'm not saying it takes away the disability, but when we talk about the medical versus the social model, and we're talking about, if you've actually got the resources so you can afford, the equipment that you need and the care you need, it makes your disability easier to manage on a day-to-day basis as a disabled person. I so infrequently have an opportunity to actually just talk about disability with other disabled people. It's been so wonderful just talking to you. That's why I think I've sort of gone off tangents sometimes with things, because it's just like, yes, it's actually talking to other people who actually get it. And it's it's so refreshing because those conversations are not happening in wider society.
Absolutely.
There is a brilliant disabled community online, and social media gets an awful lot of stick. But if you are disabled and, like me, isolated most of the time because leaving the house is a massive deal, these kind of conversations online are so helpful, and it's such a supportive community.
There is actually a lot of wisdom within the disabled community, something that I am so appreciative of, because I feel like it has helped me so much in terms of getting to me to help me understand my experiences as lived experiences as a disabled person. And yes, I echo that in terms of stuff online, but it's just so wonderful to actually be able to talk in real life rather than, just sending sort of those messages through the keyboard.
Definitely.
Yes.
I want to say something that I think is a gift that Agatha Christie gave me, is that when I first became unwell and I didn't know what was wrong with me and I didn't know what to do and I really needed comfort, and I was very, very fatigued and I was in bed a lot of the time, and I still am in bed a lot of the time now, but it was new then. And I wasn't able to read because I was so exhausted, and that's often the case now as well. So that's one of the reasons I love podcasts so much. But I started listening to the BBC Radio 4 forecast dramatisations of many of the works of Christie, and they became my sort of constant companion. So it's very comforting because I knew the story, so I didn't have to concentrate much, which I couldn't do anyway. But it was just a little bit of distraction for me and a little bit of comfort. And now if I have a bad flare-up, that's what I go back to. I go back and I listen to those plays, and it just makes me feel very safe. So I think for all that there is a lot of ableism in Christie, it's really lovely that actually I was kind of able to really lean on her work and what it means to me at, one of the darkest times in my life. And still, Agatha Christie is a tool, I guess, a coping tool that I go back to Agatha Christie when I need to feel safe and taken care of. And I suppose there's also an element of, she presents us with a chaotic world and a problem, and at the end she puts everything right. And I guess when you're feeling low or unwell or whatever, that's quite satisfying and quite comforting. So I wouldn't want to give you, obviously we're all here because we love Agatha Christie. We love her work, but I think it's nice. She sort of, in a way, I feel like she was sort of there for me, when I first got poorly, which is important, I think, to mention.
Yes, they don't describe her as convalescence reading for no reason, do they?
Exactly, yes.
I think for me, despite the flaws in terms of how some of the characters are depicted, I think the fact that she was actually including disabled people, even if we think today, what's the representation we have if you switch on the news, the media, you go to the theatre, you go to the cinema, what's the representation of disabled people today? We are still absent a lot of the time. And I think to me that's the greatest form of ableism. It's that we're absent and we're not represented. And representation really matters. And I think even if she hasn't got it right, I'm really pleased about that she's actually she's included disabled characters and she's thought about it. In The Body in the Library, when you read the forward of it, Agatha said that she actually centred the story around a disabled person that she actually saw. She describes as the person as being elderly and a crippled man, which is crippled is not a term we tend to use today, although has been a sort of a bit of reclaiming the term. And some disabled people call themselves crips. But that became the pivotal point of the story after seeing that disabled person with their family in the hotel she was staying at. So seeing a disabled person actually inspired her to write The Body in the Library. So that's another thing that I have to say, a lot of other people would have been dismissive of that person, but she actually, I think it's her observations and her imagination, and she got to work to create an absolutely lovely story, because I do love The Body in the Library.
Yeah, it's a great one. That's a good point. And that she noticed a disabled person, because sometimes people don't even seem to see that we're there. I think that's why people are always surprised by the statistics around the prevalence of disability. And I think people are surprised because they don't really see us. Either we're not able to be present because we're excluded through ableism, through lack of accessibility, through failure to anticipate our needs in planning, etc. Or people just, sometimes I really do think some people don't really see us as people. They sort of almost see past us or through us. And that's why you get people talking to the person you're with rather than you, because you're sitting in a wheelchair, and so they think that you can't talk or they shouldn't be addressing you, etc. That feeling of being invisible. But I think it will be interesting to see how things change, because hate to bring up the dreaded COVID, but this pandemic is a mass disabling event. There are a lot of people who are very unwell, and many of them may never recover to the levels of function that they had before they contracted COVID. And I think it was interesting in the early days of the pandemic, I did feel a little bit like there was some sort of appreciation, especially during lockdown, that people understood a little bit more what it's like to not be able to leave the house, as much as you would like to. And for lots of people, not really at all. But as we've got kind of further away from those early days, I feel like perhaps the change isn't as lasting. But given that there are lots of people who are going to be chronically ill, or at least, long-term unwell, sadly, as a result of this, it will certainly be interesting to sort of see how discussions about disability in the media are, sort of how they go.
You have all done an excellent job of winding down the conversation, and I love a lot of these concluding thoughts. And in closing, I think, because we've been talking for a while now, I wanted to bring up 2 points. This has been quite instructive as a host, because I had a whole bunch of bullet points here of things that I wanted to cover, and I've seen you tick them off one by one, not necessarily in the order I had them, but just covering so many different texts and I think points about ableism and Christie. So I have really enjoyed listening to your conversation, just being a listener. There was one really interesting point, though, that was made when we were doing the preparation for this episode that I just wanted to highlight, because I thought it was such an excellent example of, I guess we could call it an internalized ableist trope. And that has to do with Mrs. McGinty's Dead. So just fast forward a few minutes if you haven't yet read that book. But the murderer in that book is a carer for someone with a disability. That would be Robin, who is caring for his mother. It's all complicated, but that is a carer for a woman with a disability. And one of you had made the point that we do have that carer character in many other Christie novels. And often when the person caring for a disabled person is caring for a disabled man, there's a big deal made about the fact that this carer is very virile and big and strong. And that happens in A Caribbean Mystery. It also happens in Curtain. And I thought it was really fascinating that one of the reasons why Robin in Mrs. McGinty's Dead goes off the rails and is a murderer is that he feels emasculated by his role caring for this woman with a disability. And I just wondered if you could speak to the contrast there, which is also a little bit of an intersectionality point, because sex and gender, I think, is coming to play there in terms of, are you a carer for a man? Are you a carer for a woman? And I think there's a bit of interplay there between gender and disability. I wonder if you would agree with that.
When I made the point, I actually was thinking about the gender of the carer, not the person being cared for. What I was thinking was that conventionally we think of, or certainly at the time, and perhaps less so now, but more so in Agatha Christie's time, that caring roles, particularly within a family, are taken on by the women. And in that book, there wasn't a woman, so there was only Robin to take on any caring role. And as you and Catherine observed in the podcast, that he was emasculated in a number of ways, and that being an unpaid carer was one of them. And that the other two carers who you referenced that were male, who were paid carers, were very physical. But of course, I hadn't actually made the connection that they were also carers of men. But I think Jenni picked up on Philip in Ordeal by Innocence needing a carer. So perhaps you can add to that.
Yeah, I think, again, Philip is the person being cared for, and he very much feels emasculated by being cared for. And I think specifically by being cared for by a woman. And perhaps he might even feel, I think also because she's his wife. So perhaps if he had a paid female carer, I think he'd still feel emasculated, but maybe not quite in the same way. The roles in their marriage are quite interesting. And I don't know whether many disabled people would recognise themselves in that portrayal. Probably not many. Certainly doesn't match with my experience. He feels helpless by being cared for. And really, a successful carer should be one who facilitates the cared for person to be as independent as they possibly can, to make sure that they can reach their potential. Whereas I don't think that's Mary's view of what her role is. And I think that might be part of where that sort of friction comes from. But then, of course, interestingly, that seems to drive Philip towards taking on this role of amateur detective. I think because he wants to prove, maybe to himself as much as to anybody else, that he's capable, that there are things he can do, that he can think and he can work things out. And also he does stir the pot, I think, a bit, doesn't he? He quite likes to stir things up and see what kind of reaction he gets, which I suppose is him asserting some sort of control. So I think he feels quite stifled by Mary's care, and she seems to define their relationship on the basis that she cares for him and he needs her as a carer, not that he needs her because he loves her, because she's his partner. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know whether they talk much about what their relationship was like prior to Philip becoming disabled, whether it was a troubled marriage initially, or whether the implication is that the disability caused the trouble. But they're certainly not partners, and she isn't facilitating him to live his best life, and he's very cruel to her as a result, which again I think is about exerting power, isn't it? It's a power dynamic that's there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Also contrasting, I think, the paid relationship between carer and carry versus something that's more domestic, right? And more within the realm of just regular domesticity, which, as I think all of you, made this point earlier in the episode, disabled characters are made to not fit into the domestic sphere perhaps as easily or organically as non-disabled characters. That is definitely a bias that I think we could point to in text after text after text. I have one question before we go, because I couldn't not ask this question, because I know it's just something that's on so many people's minds who listen to this podcast and who are readers of Agatha Christie. I think Tina made this point a couple of times during this conversation, that the ableism on display in Christie is somewhat fundamental in that the ableist trope of not trusting someone as to whether or not they are disabled or ill is fundamental to the mystery genre, because people are constantly being questioned and doubted for any number of reasons, right? Well, you say that you were in this place at 8 p.m., but maybe you weren't. Or you say that this is your name, but maybe this is not your name. Maybe you're someone completely different. People are wearing masks constantly. And it seems that Agatha Christie was willing to distrust people or place suspicion upon people as to their emotional and physical well-being as well. So that was one of the ways in which she obfuscated when she was creating a lot of these mysteries. And that's problematic and it's potentially hurtful. And that's a lot of what was being discussed. But it is also fundamental to a lot of these stories. So it strikes me that if there were ever a push to excise the ableism and ableist tropes that appear in Christie's work from the text themselves, I just don't see how that's possible. So first of all, that's one question that I have for you, whether you agree with that. Maybe you're more sanguine about that, but this is a conversation that obviously many people have been having recently, since we know that there is some sort of a project going on as to excising certain aspects of the texts that may jar a modern day reader as to racism, anti-Semitism, and any other number of issues. As far as I know, ableism has not been addressed in any of those edits that have been made, but I really just don't know, because I think there's a lot that we don't know about these edits. We just know that there are some that have been made in the past couple of years, and I think we have to keep an open mind as we're figuring out what that means. But I just am curious how you feel about that project of editing in relation to the ableism that exists in the texts.
There is another approach you can take if you're uncomfortable with the ableism in Agatha Christie's text. And that would be that, is it Agatha Christie Limited or whoever owns the rights to all the texts, is that when they sell those rights for screen adaptations, that they include clauses that say that disabled characters must be played by actors with the same disability as the characters, and that disabled people with the conditions that are being portrayed on screen are also involved behind the scenes in an advisory capacity. And then once you start opening up sets, once sets are accessible to disabled people, then it opens up a world of possibilities for people who are disabled to be involved in the adaptations. And that would be a way of using Agatha Christie's legacy of many disabled characters, which, as Tina pointed out before, not many other authors include huge numbers of disabled characters like Agatha Christie does. And I think that would be a really positive way of addressing the ableism in the books, which, as you say, is very, very difficult to completely get rid of.
In July 2020, Agatha Christie Limited actually consulted with me about some of the language they were using. At that point, they were going to do a reprint of Death on the Nile, and they were particularly concerned about Simon Doyle, when he gets shot, I won't say by who, and the term lameness was used a couple of times in the book. So I had a look at the book today because I've got it on Kindle, so it updates. And it actually does say now, instead of lameness, they've got permanent injury. So they have actually changed it. So they are concerned about language. And what they were saying to me was they want to be inclusive. They don't want to offend everyone. And they want everyone to be able to enjoy Agatha. So they came to me for that. And last year, when I finally got round to reading Curtain, I noticed on the Agatha Christie website, Poirot is described as being wheelchair bound. So I went. I went to Agatha Christie Limited only because I could through a DM. I went through to Agatha Christie Limited and I basically said, could you change the language? He's not wheelchair bound. I said, for people who have got mobility aids and adaptations, they are actually really liberating. They enable us, they empower us. We can do things with our aids and adaptations. So can you please change language? So he's now written, it's now been changed. He's now arthritic and immobilized. That's how they've changed it. And I haven't gone back to say whatever, because the other thing is language is constantly evolving. And we might think today we've got the perfect terminology for disability. You know, in 10, 15 years' time, we will realise that what we're saying was actually whatever, and it's been, you know, something else has come into place, which is much more appropriate for people. But what I really wanted to say was I've had a very positive experience with Agatha Christie Limited in terms of their sort of commitment to it. They do want to make it, everyone can just enjoy Agatha. They don't want anyone to be offended or upset by it. They just want people to feel that, you know, Agatha is for them.
That's wonderful to hear. And I love that, because I think it's the conversations that move us forward, you know, and if people are reaching out, you know, Agatha Christie Limited are reaching out to learn, that's fantastic. The fact that we're doing this episode of All About Agatha today is fantastic. I really love your idea, Emma, as well. I'm not ableist isn't the same as being actively anti-ableism. And obviously that's the same for lots of different forms of prejudice and discrimination. So that idea of actually not just Agatha Christie Limited, but all sorts of other organisations and institutions being proactive, ensuring that disabled people are involved in these processes. And I think you made that really excellent point that the more accessible things are, the better for everybody. Everybody benefits from highly accessible spaces and accessible conversations and accessible groups of people where people are open and therefore accessible. They're open to have these kinds of conversations. That benefits everybody, not just disabled people.
Thank you so much, Emma and Tina and Jenni. As I said at the beginning of this episode, I am so grateful that you spent the time and the prep time too. There was a lot of work put into this episode, and this is a conversation that was so well worth having. And it shouldn't just be a single conversation. I mean, my hope is that this will raise an awareness as to an issue that really is ongoing and that I think people should be speaking about. It involves speaking to others with all sorts of perspectives. And I think one of my favorite things about this conversation that I couldn't have predicted before we started it was how much this notion of intersectionality really came up, because people have so many facets and aspects to their identity, and we're talking about one of them, but it's impossible to talk about anything in isolation. And there are so many different ways in which we are people. But I feel like the three of you gave a fuller picture of that than we would normally get just from reading Agatha Christie without your perspective. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you again, a million times over, to Jenni Bishop, Tina Hodgkinson, and Emma. I think they had such a brilliant conversation, and all I had to do was sit there and listen. We actually recorded that conversation pretty late in the day, their time, due to time difference issues. And after we stopped recording, I believe it was Tina who said, "You didn't ask us whether we prefer Poirot or Marple." I neglected to ask them the age-old question, so that simply means they'll have to come on the podcast again. I would certainly love it if they did. And I'd love to hear from you, as I always do, as to your thoughts on ableism in Christie and this conversation that Jenni, Tina, and Emma just had about ableism. Shoot me an email over at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. For my next episode, I am actually going to be bringing you another co-host. I'm very excited about this. I will be discussing the Agatha Christie short story Star Over Bethlehem, which is distinctly Christmas themed. It's going to be Christmas in June here on All About Agatha. And my co-host is Sarah Hinlicky Wilson, who is a Lutheran pastor. She is a podcaster. She is a scholar of theology and Agatha Christie, and many things besides. I can't wait to bring you that episode about this little-known Agatha Christie short story. So that will be in 2 weeks' time. And of course, you could always check out the podcast's Patreon page over at www.patreon.com, patreon.com/allaboutagatha, or just click on the link in the show notes. Check out my most recent episode, all about The Burden by Mary Westmacott. please feel free to pre-order my Agatha Christie-inspired mystery novel, which will be coming out January of 2024. I have provided a link in the show notes to my publisher, which offers an array of booksellers from which to choose, including bookshop.org, which is a way to order online from independent bookstores. You can reach the podcast on Twitter at AllAboutTheDame and on Instagram at AllAboutAgatha. And as always, I would appreciate any ratings and or reviews you could give me wherever you are listening to this podcast. And I'll see you next time. Bye.
Ready to level up your career? Text DISH to 44043 now to dive into a world of exciting technician opportunities at DISH. From cutting-edge technology to a supportive work environment, DISH offers the perfect platform for your success. Connect with us today to discover how you can be part of a dynamic team driving innovation. Connect today and join the DISH family, where innovation meets opportunity. Text DISH to 44043 to kickstart your journey towards a rewarding career.
Whether you're looking to build a website for your business, your hobby, your podcast, or just for fun, Pair Networks is your go-to web hosting partner. Not only do we have the lowest domain price in the industry, starting at just $11, we've got hundreds of stunning website templates to help you stand out from the crowd. You're not a techie? Not a problem. With our easy DIY site builders, you can launch your impressive website without any technical know-how. And when it comes to security and updates, don't worry, we've got you covered. Our 24/7 US-based customer support is the best in the industry. Check out pair.com today to learn more. PAIR.com.